Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Kate Masur. Kate is an associate professor of history at Northwestern University. She has written extensively on race and politics in the 19th century United States, and she is the author of 4 books. And today we will speak about her latest book, Until Justice Be Done: America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. Kate, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kate, I'm super excited to have this interview because this is the first time that I speak to someone while they are driving. Hopefully, you will not get into an accident while we're having this conversation. But can you tell the listeners, where are you right now?
Sure. So my eyes are fixed on the road as I drive down Highway 90 from the Chicago area up to Madison, Wisconsin.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for multitasking and having this interview with us in spite of your traveling plans. Can we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself? How is it that you became interested in history and your trajectory to becoming an associate professor?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know. It's a good question. I got interested in history, in U.S. history, I think out of the sense of curiosity about how we got to where we are today. So I, in college, was interested in history, but also in like cultural studies and kind of analyzing the present. And then the more I continued my education in graduate school, I gravitated toward really thinking about the past and how do we account for certain kinds of events and patterns in American history, but always with an eye on why things are the way they are now.
And also an eye on racial relationships, because of course you could have looked at the past from so many different lenses. What is it about race and culture that caught your interest?
Yeah, that's another good question. So I'm white and I grew up right outside of Chicago in a suburb called Oak Park, which is somewhat well known for having undertaken kind of like an experiment in controlled desegregation in the 1970s, and it continues now. So when my parents moved there in the mid 1970s, Oak Park had already started. It had been historically a very white, kind of Protestant suburb right next to Chicago, and it was right next to the west side of Chicago, and the west side had in the past been an immigrant neighborhood, primarily European immigrants living there, and it had gradually become an increasingly an African-American neighborhood, and was also the site of riots and kind of property destruction when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And this was, the period of kind of white flight and block busting by real estate agents. And so apparently the city of Oak Park, which again bordered on the west side of Chicago, which was undergoing this kind of racial transition, the city government decided to try to both prevent white flight, but also not try to exclude African Americans from moving into the city, but rather try to create, through kind of social engineering, a desegregated, integrated community. And that's where I grew up. My parents intentionally chose to live there. And so I feel like I grew up in this experiment that's actually very unusual for the United States, in a family that was pretty liberal and conscious of thinking about these kind of issues. And I think that's where my really longstanding interest in questions about race and inequality came from.
And can you tell us a little bit about your career? So you decided to start studying history, and how from being a student you became a professor or an associate professor?
Sure. So when I was in college, and when I went to college, I really had no idea what I was going to major in or what I was going to do when I grew up. And gradually over time in college, I got more and more interested in like continuing my education and seeing if I could be a professor. It seemed like a pretty great job. And so I went to University of Michigan for graduate school, and I actually got my PhD in American Studies, which is a kind of the interdisciplinary cultural sort of study of the United States. But as I said before, I gravitated to history professors and the history department, even though I wasn't actually in the history department. And then I ended up writing a dissertation as part of my degree on the history of Reconstruction in Washington, D.C. And everybody, both back then and now even more, when you're finishing up a PhD in a field like that, it's never certain that you're going to get a job or get a tenure track job or get a job that is a viable job in a place that you want to live. And I was wondering when I was finishing, is this really going to work out? Am I going to ever get to be a professor after all of this, years of work I put into getting a PhD? And I was fortunate that it worked out, and I got the job. Well, actually first got a job as a kind of editor at the University of Maryland at a research project. So I did that for 2 years. And then I got this job at Northwestern University. And so I've been at Northwestern teaching since 2005. And I actually just got promoted. So as of, I think a month or two from now, I'll be a full professor.
Woohoo,
So I've been at Northwestern for a long time. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so then you are busy pursuing your career, but you decide in the midst of all that to start writing books. Can you tell us some of the titles of the books that you have written, and maybe the mindset that helped you get through the first book? You decide to say, okay, I have all this responsibility, but I'm going to write a first book.
Yeah, I mean, well, when you're in a job like the one that I have at Northwestern, you also want to keep your job because you're going to go on for 10 years, assistant professor. And at Northwestern, you have to have a book in order to get tenure. And if you don't have a book and the book is not well received, you basically lose your job. So I partially, had to write the book if I wanted to keep on this career path that I really like and was committed to. So my first book was a revised and expanded version of my dissertation, and it's called An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle Over Equality in Washington, D.C. And it's a history of emancipation and Reconstruction in the capital, Washington, D.C. And so that was like a monograph. It's still out there. It's published by UNC Press. And that was the book that helped me get tenure, and it was the first book that I wrote. And then after that, I just kind of kept pursuing my interest in the field and ended up doing an edited collection with a guy I collaborate with a lot, Greg Downs, who teaches at UC Davis, called The World the Civil War Made. And that's a collection of essays about the Reconstruction period and just trying to kind of rethink what were the consequences of the Civil War and how do we understand the period that followed the Civil War.
Okay, so now let's talk about your book, Unto Justice Be Done. So my first question is, at one time in history, all the states in the United States were slave states, I guess. Slavery was legal everywhere. When, at what moment and which states started to become free states? They said, okay, enough of that. We would like to be a free state instead of a slave state.
So the original jurisdictions that became states of the United States were originally colonies, right? And so during the course of the American Revolution, as the states are basically declaring their independence from Great Britain and kind of thinking about ways of coming together as a new nation, Vermont was actually first to declare that it would not permit. After that came a formal legislative way. The legislature of Pennsylvania in 1780 passed the first it's called gradual emancipation law, that basically created a way to abolish slavery over a period of years. And subsequently, Massachusetts, New York, all of the New England states, and then as far south as the state of New Jersey, which was last, it passed state level laws that provided for the abolition of slavery, if not immediately, then over time. But at the same time, other states, so south of New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and everywhere south of there, to some extent had debates around the time of the American Revolution about whether to abolish slavery or whether to loosen laws around slavery to make it easier for people to become free, and eventually really doubled down on slavery. So you have the creation of a bifurcated United States, the creation of what would later become the North and the South, free states in the northern part of the country and slave states in the southern part.
And for those states that became free states, what was their main motivation? Was it humanitarian? Was it egalitarian? Or what was going on in their mind when they made that decision that Vermont, for example, that we are going to be free from slavery?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the more that slavery was a crucial part of the economy of a state, the more likely the legislators in that state were to hold on to slavery. So it was comparatively easy and without very much cost for a place like Vermont to declare that they were not going to allow slavery, because there were not very many enslaved people in Vermont. The economy was not very dependent on the labor of enslaved people. So you contrast that with Virginia, which is where people are heavily invested in slavery and there are enormous amounts of wealth are being created through slavery. And so it's much easier to abolish slavery in Vermont. But then you also have the aspect of it that's about ideas and kind of ideology, which is there were a lot of ideas floating around at the time of the American Revolution that slavery was morally wrong, right? And that everybody was actually entitled to be free and to, in some measure, control their destiny and to not have to be coerced into laboring for another person without pay, without any choice of whether they're going to do that or not. And so there was a kind of impulse among some people to say, look, if we have a choice, let's get rid of slavery, right? Let's not attach ourselves to this very coercive, horrible institution that goes against a lot of Enlightenment ideas about the dignity and kind of intrinsic freedom of human beings. But as I said, however much those ideas might have been floating around, only some white people acted on them, and others found ways of disregarding those ideas about equality and excusing and justifying continuing slavery, in part because they didn't imagine themselves to be able to let go of it economically.
Right, okay. So now in those states that are free states, in spite of being free, they have some discriminatory laws. They have so what are those laws that the black laws, I think you mentioned in your book, can you describe what those laws are?
Many of the free states had laws that discriminated against free African Americans. So while they were outlawing slavery, they also had various kinds of laws that said that telegraphed the idea that Black people were kind of subordinate or not equal to white people. And this varied a lot state by state. So a place like Massachusetts had relatively few of these discriminatory laws. In Massachusetts, African American men had the right to vote, and the racially discriminatory laws in Massachusetts by the 1820s and 1830s, basically Massachusetts barred interracial marriage and did not allow Black men to serve in state militia. Those were the two racist laws on the books in Massachusetts. Now the states in the Midwest, starting with Ohio and especially Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, all had a whole range of racially discriminatory laws that went well beyond that. So they required African Americans living in the state to register with county officials. They didn't allow African Americans to testify in court cases that involved white people. They did not allow African American men to vote. They barred Black children from public education. And all of these laws basically were designed to make life very difficult for Black people living in those states and to discourage migration of African Americans into the states. And so you have this, even in the absence of slavery, you have this system in many places set up to create racial inequality and to kind of configure Black people as as outcasts, as second-class citizens, if you will.
Okay, at this time in history, in the southern states, they had a predominant representation of the Democratic Party, which at that time in history was the pro-slavery party, and the Republican Party was the anti-slavery party. So they were divided mostly in South Democratic and North Republican. But in these free states, what is their main political tendency?
Yeah, so when you said it was the Republican Party against the Democratic Party, that sort of fast forwards to the late 1850s, because
Right.
the Republican Party doesn't really get off the ground until after 1854. And so before that, what you have this political system that is the Democrats on the one hand and the Whig Party on the other hand. And although the Democrats are sort of more pro-slavery and favor the expansion of slavery more kind of stringently than the Whigs are pretty pro-slavery too in the general sense, or on the national scene. And so one of the dynamics that I write about in my book is about how did people Northerners especially, who disliked slavery, who didn't want to see the political parties continue to support slavery or continue to support these racist laws in the states. If you were a person like that in that time, what would you do politically? Would you keep voting for candidates from one of the two major parties because you realize that the parties were not going to change and you're voting for the lesser of two evils? Would you try to form a third political party that, although it would be small, could make a difference in local elections? And so there are these questions that to me actually had a lot of resonance with the present about how to deal with a situation where you're in basically a minority in terms of how you feel, where you think the country should go, and what you do to organize politically. And what the people I write about, some of them got involved in a third party movements in the 1840s. There was something called the Liberty Party that was a third party alternative, later a Free Soil Party, and they don't necessarily have huge successes, although they do that configuration of politics does help in the end get the Ohio Black laws repealed. But that kind of configuration of political organizing helps feed into what becomes the Republican Party. So it's a little bit complicated, but what it really shows is kind of some of the challenges of trying to make political change in a two-party system, and then how this particular group of people grappled with those issues.
Right. Okay. So now in these free states, these Northwestern states in particular, there are civil rights movements. People are asking for more or less discrimination, more equality. Could you describe who were these activists? Who were they, just blacks or blacks and whites, profession? Yeah, any kind of description of who was pushing for these new egalitarian laws?
In the book, I talk about how people mobilized to overturn these racist laws and to argue that that the United States needed to have racial equality in what were called civil rights at the time. And so, so among the people who cared the most about this, of course, were Black people, Black Americans, who faced the consequences of this discrimination most directly. And I found from as early as we can find records published by African Americans, whether they were writing sometimes for white publications, or by the late 1820s when you have the first African American run newspaper, Freedom's Journal, or even earlier, I found there's a pamphlet by a Philadelphia Black activist named James Fortin about why Pennsylvania should not adopt these kind of racially discriminatory laws. We find African Americans speaking out and explaining to white people why these laws are damaging, why they violate the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, why they will make Black people vulnerable both to white authorities, to people like police and constables, but also to white mobs. The idea that these racist laws actually help incite white Americans who might keep their feelings to themselves, but when they feel legitimated by the existence of racist laws, will go after Black people in a more lawless way. And so I trace a lot of African American agitation around getting rid of these racist laws or stopping their states from passing them in the first place. And then they also have a lot of white allies. Many of the white people who get involved in these movements at the state level are also abolitionists. So they would favor abolishing slavery nationwide. But of course, where they live, let's say they live in Ohio or they live in Pennsylvania, there is not slavery in those states. And so they turn their attention to the question of racial equality within their states at home. And so many times actually, the African Americans organize in separate organizations from the white activists. But we also see moments of convergence, times when they're working together or publishing each other's work in their different periodicals. And so I portray it as a movement that was biracial, that Black and white people alike participated in, but it was really African Americans kind of leading the way and having the most egalitarian vision for the United States at that time.
Right. Here in Montreal, I marched for the Black Lives Matters movement. I just went to a square and I stood there for a while. We walked for a little bit and then I walked back home. It was a peaceful demonstration. I wonder at this time in history, how these manifestations or these protests are being displayed. Are they peaceful? Are they violent? Are they a mixture of the two extremes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and to kind of compare it to experiences that many of us have had in the last year or years protesting against racist violence in the present. So for one thing, in many cases, the people who were trying to speak against slavery, people who were trying to argue that slavery itself was immoral or that the Black laws needed to be repealed, they themselves faced violent retaliation. So they were generally peaceful and basically would do things like try to get somebody in a small town, let's imagine we're in Ohio, to let them use a building like a church or a hall to give a speech about why they thought more people should take a stand against slavery or in favor of racial equality. And they would face mobs. People would gather together and throw rocks at them, or in the first place, somebody would say, "You can't speak." Unfortunately, there's nowhere in this town where you can have your talk. And people particularly went after Black people who were involved in this movement, who were, of course, more vulnerable than most white people because they were working, pretty menial jobs. They could easily get fired. There were lots of threats to their livelihood, that if they were to participate in this, they would get fired. Or that they would be run out of town, and they didn't have, in a place like Ohio, rights to testify in court cases. And so if somebody stole their property and they wanted to go to court and try to get it back, they would have very limited ability to do that. So there's a lot of violence on the part of the people who want to suppress discussion of these issues. And that's one of the things that's quite impressive and moving about the people that I write about, is that they continued to organize in this way despite that violence. And in fact, when they were violently attacked, they used that as kind of, ammunition in their arguments for why they were the true Americans and their opponents were very un-American for not allowing for a free debate and not allowing people to speak their minds.
Okay, so my next question is a little bit out of the context of your book, but as a historian, I'm sure you have an opinion. So the Republican Party at this time in history is the party that wants to eliminate slavery and wants to give the right to the Black people to vote. And today we see the Republican Party as the one who wants to suppress the Black vote. Do you have, a simple explanation on that transformation of the Republican Party, how they went to the party of the Black people to the party that suppressed the Black vote?
A lot of people have this question, and it's a really important question, and it's really important that people understand, first of all, that parties can change in their ideology, right? And so yes, indeed, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln at the time in the 1860s and 70s. It was the party that led the fight against the Confederacy. It was the party that supported the abolition of slavery, that supported racial equality, that supported Black men's right to vote, that actually wanted to use the federal government to defend people's rights and to protect people's rights, right? So they were actually also in favor of larger federal power to curtail what the states could do. So what we see now is pretty much the opposite of that, where not only are the Republicans trying to make it harder for a lot of people to vote, but they also want states to have more control over voting, as we just saw in yesterday's Supreme Court decision on the Arizona case. They want the states to have a lot more control and have the Voting Rights Act, which is obviously a federal measure, mean a lot less. So how did this change happen? It happened primarily in the 20th century, and it's a long story that we teach quite regularly in our classes in college. But essentially, the Democratic Party, particularly around the time of the Great Depression, so 1929 and into the 1930s, increasingly becomes a party that's interested in helping the poor people in general. And at the time of the New Deal and the Franklin Roosevelt administration, there was still primarily the Democrats in the South were segregationists. They were overt white supremacists. They were suppressing the Black vote. But African Americans had increasingly moved from the South into the North and increasingly formed a voting bloc, kind of pro-civil rights voting bloc in the northern states. So Black people begin to join the Democratic Party because they think that despite whatever the segregationists in the South are doing, the Roosevelt administration and the northern pieces of the Democratic Party, with their connections to labor, actually to the AFL-CIO and labor movement, has more potential to kind of oversee a civil rights agenda. And then conversely, the Republicans increasingly stand for conservatism. And that doesn't really fully take shape until the 1960s, when it's the Democrats under Lyndon Johnson Lyndon Johnson's presidency that really begin to lead the way on federal civil rights measures. And Republicans, although many Republicans actually supported things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Republican Party increasingly becomes the party that thinks the government went too far on that, increasingly becomes a party that organizes at least part of its base around racial resentment, around white people's resentment of the gains that African Americans have experienced in those years. And so there's a kind of reversal that happens that continues. I mean, we see it continuing into the 1970s and 1980s. So even then you have, like, for example, President Jimmy Carter or President Bill Clinton were both Democratic, white Democrats from states from the former Confederacy who become president. Now it would be much harder to find a national candidate who would be a white Democrat from the Deep South. So that's a very short kind of gloss on a longer thing, but it's a critically important question. I encourage you and all of your listeners to kind of learn for yourselves how this happened. And because, sometimes these days Republicans try to hang their hats on the idea that they were once the party of emancipation and the Democrats were once the party of the Ku Klux Klan. And although that is true, that really doesn't have very much to do with party alignments in the present.
Right. Okay. Well, you are a historian and you have taken us all the way to the present, and you are driving, so I don't want to keep you much longer. But if you could look forward as a historian, will justice one day be done? Because we're still suffering a lot of discriminations, racial inequalities. Where do you see the future, let's say, I don't know, 10, 20, 50 years from now?
It's a really tough question. I feel like we're hanging in the balance between two completely different paths this country could take. I think sometimes in the Trump years, I felt like it was so paradoxical because on the one hand, you have more Americans, including more white people, understanding more and more about the history of racial discrimination, the continuing problems of structural racial inequality, and sort of more and more people poised to really try to do things that would make a difference to solve these problems that have run through our history for so long. And yet, on the other hand, we had, the election of Donald Trump as president, somebody who ran on a very racist kind of platform, who was not at all interested in those issues, and quite to the contrary, was willing to incite racists who wanted to kind of stick to him and his party. So, and then when we sort of look at where we are now, again, we have the undermining of the right to vote. I feel like it's very, very serious what's going on right now I'm very depressed about and down about yesterday's Supreme Court decision, which combined with state level efforts by Republicans, can really make a difference in driving down voter turnout, and that which will favor, in a way that will favor Republican victories in upcoming elections. And at the same time, right, we have these very undemocratic institutions structured into this country, the United States Senate, where, you know, the number of people represented by the Republicans in the Senate is so much smaller than the number of people represented by the Democrats in the Senate. And then we have the Electoral College. And so we have all of these institutions that at this time are really favoring Republicans who are in the minority nationally. And so that is very scary because it's a structural problem that is very difficult to solve. And then on the other hand, we have the possibility, particularly if the Democrats decide to find a way to get around the filibuster in the Senate, of actually passing legislation that can protect the right to vote, that can counteract some of these anti-democratic institutions. So I think we're at a point of tremendous risk. I think we could go kind of either way, and I'm very concerned. But I also have a certain amount of optimism that we'll find somehow we will find our way to a right course, a course that favors greater democracy and the ability of everyone to have input in their government.
Right. America always does the right thing after they try everything else.
Well, I don't know. It could go the other. I'm trying to stay optimistic.
Okay, well, could you, yes, the last question, could you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow your work?
Sure. So the book is Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. I have a Twitter feed. It's at Kate Masur, Katemasur. And I'm on there from time to time. And yeah, you can always just send me an email to my Northwestern email address if you're interested in following up.
I'm so grateful. And thank you so much for doing this while driving. So on to soon.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Just stop this meeting. Hold on, don't go away.
Okay.